Hello, class. In this session, we'll be discussing what role do feelings and emotions play in understanding conflict. And I want to make sure that this is, something that we really spend some time thinking about as individuals, and that we continue to return to, thoughts about how our feelings and emotions end up being something that maybe we have control over, and the way that we have opportunities to kind of stimulate some of that in ourselves. Regularly, right? I think it's actually a big part of, kind of the personal growth part of the maturation process. Um, Although I don't get to tell you how to act, and I don't get to tell you how you should feel about things, what I do want to encourage as kind of a conflict coach is that one regularly thinks about what things that they do and do not have control over. Because you'll find that things that you used to have control over, sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't have control over them, going forward. Um, and that is to say, this is a really big deal. There's three satisfactions that I present for dealing with conflict: substantive, emotional, and procedural. Emotional is a big deal. If you are not emotionally satisfied in a conflict, it is not resolved. Sometimes emotions don't matter, but when they do matter, they're a big deal. So that's something to soak in. If you see somebody else is extremely lit up about what's happening in a conflict, you'll also observe that until that emotion has been addressed or dealt with in some way, shape, or form, the conflict is not over. Whether or not you've reached an agreement, if the person's still upset, if they're still angry, so on and so forth, the conflict is ongoing, whether or not you've got something in writing. So, what am I saying here? I'm saying here that we have multiple parties and all of them have the opportunity to have feelings about what's happening. So, you being one of the parties in the conflict, or you being a mediator between parties in the conflict, paying attention to what's going on in terms of emotions and feelings is is really significant. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. Um, but first, let's just think about, right? Let's think about what are the details here. So first of all, if somebody's in a mood, right? The mood is kind of the gravity of the day, the gravity of the occasion, the kind of general air about a situation or about an individual. I give different examples. Some of the ones that I've used about myself in specific are things that relate to whether or not I've had enough sleep. And I've been very, very reflective of my self awareness that my cognitive performance is diminished if I haven't slept enough. But also my emotional performance can be really diminished, right? If I haven't slept enough, usually I can be edgier. Stress aggravates me more. I might be more generally frustrated. As my cognitive performance is failing because I'm tired, that can also become kind of compounded by the gravity of a situation that I'm frustrated, I'm having a bad day, and now this is just something else that's adding to it, right? So, to some degree, I can't control that, right? My frustrations, as much as I wish sometimes that I could be more zen, they get to me and I can't do much about it. On the other hand, I have a lot of control. I have a lot of control about my ability to make sure that I do take the correct steps to make sure that I get more sleep. Um, Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But, right, if I know that step A can be taken to impact, an outcome of getting more sleep, and that might be going to bed at a more reasonable time, and I don't take step A, I don't necessarily get to tell myself, in good conscience, it's not my fault. I'm frustrated the next day when I didn't get enough sleep. Um, if I try to go to bed early and I'm unable to fall asleep, or if you try to go to bed early but then there's noises that are outside of your control, that's a different story, clearly. Um, but if we know that there's a predictive relationship between certain events having an impact on us, which contribute to our emotions, feelings, and moods, and so forth, right? That self-awareness can go a long way. I know for other people, they can describe this in terms of the relationship to food or eating, and that frequently what happens is that when people are stressed out, they might say, work through lunch, get to the part where they don't even realize at the end of the day that maybe they haven't eaten all day. And so that could have a physical impact on low blood sugar and so forth. But then again, right? So there's a variety of ways that we can have direct control over things that are likely to have significant impacts on some of our feelings and moods and emotions and so forth. We also have ways that we know things in some sort of predictive sense, at least when there's past experiences with it, that if we know that we don't like, say, watching people slug it out until somebody's beat, bloodied, and bruised or whatever, that we probably shouldn't go over to the friend's house when they've ordered like some pay-per-view death match or ultimate fighting gladiator arena competition event or something, right? If you know that watching that's going to bother you, then why would you put yourself in the situation where that's going to happen, right? And so this can happen in any of a whole host of things. Traumatizing spaces, traumatizing places, traumatizing experiences. But it doesn't always have to be traumatizing. Sometimes it's just triggering. And sometimes, we get surprised by it too, that sometimes we're watching a movie and we find that, wow, I'm feeling a lot more emotional about this than I expected, right? Again, that's the reflection. There are parts that you might have control and knowledge about, and then there are parts where you might not really realize what's going to get to you. So, about conflict, right? Because that's the key. Everything that we talk about needs to play into this underlying detail. How can this help us to understand conflict? And so the underlying detail here is that it can help us to understand ourselves. Our feelings and emotions can help us to understand ourselves. And feelings and emotions can help us to understand others. Sometimes we can see things and not actually know what it means, right? One person may not always be able to identify the difference between tears of happiness and tears of sorrow. But you might have a good guess. And if you're really not sure, you might be able to ask in a way that's not insensitive. I mean, I wouldn't recommend, right? I wouldn't recommend to the person who's wearing all black clothing, who's crying, pardon me, I just was curious, are you happy or sad right now? Because the person might end up feeling like you're a real jerk, and ask if they're happy while they're mourning. But you can ask if you have the relationship to ask, or you can ask others, right? Like if you want to know, but maybe you need to have a reason to be curious or something. Anyway, if you see something, you can usually try to pick up on some of the cues, verbal or nonverbal. And if somebody's sad, somebody's crying, what would you do about that in terms of a conflict? Well, first of all, I wouldn't expect to necessarily be able to resolve a conflict with a party that's in tears, because you're not likely to get to the resolution part of a conflict until the emotion has been addressed. So if I'm dealing with that person, either because professionally I'm in a position where I'm trying to be a neutral third party, or because I'm an individual involved with somebody who's now crying, the first step might be like to hand the person a tissue. And in my mediator's code, I definitely had a couple packs of Kleenex to say, here you go. And when the person was saying, like, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be so emotional right now, just to be very upfront, like, you have nothing to apologize. I understand this is extremely emotional, and why don't you tell me about that? Before we go any further, tell me about the emotions you're feeling right now. What's going on for you? Unpacking the emotions was absolutely 100% essential. And sometimes the emotions are there for very, very specific reasons. I can't tell you the number of cases, right? Example, right? Single mother doesn't know how she's going to pay something, knows she owes for it. She's crying because she's afraid. Getting that out. Okay, so tell me about all the things that you do have going on for you. What do you owe? How much is this going to be? What else do you owe for it, right? And then getting to the part where it's like, so what I'd like to do with the rest of this caucus is get to the part where we think about a plan that would work for you. If we can come up with a plan that would work for you, I'd like for you to think about it while the other person's in session with me. And if you feel comfortable, like you could offer that it's something that would work for you, I'd like for you to feel like you should feel empowered to be able to share that with the other person. By explaining to the person that you can't pay beyond a certain amount, that there's an amount that you could make in payments, there's a chance that the person might be able to agree to that. And if both of you are able to agree to something, that might work out better for both of you. But so then we would work on a plan, right? Somebody could think about their budget, what they're likely to have in terms of expenses for other details. But that doesn't, you don't get the person who's crying and say, well, let's work on a budget. You have to deal with the emotion, the fear first. Because as long as the person's afraid, they're unlikely to have very much movement, right? So you get to that part, the person thinks through their plan, their strategy. Sometimes that person that's thinking through their plan and strategy isn't somebody you're working with, but it's you working with yourself. Process your emotions first to give yourself as much opportunity to use the rational part of your brain, right? The reason center of your brain gets to have kind of more of the energy. I don't have psychological studies or something here to say, because I certainly don't want to claim that all people are the same, but this is one of the details that I know from my own experience. And if that doesn't work that way for you, well, then just do it the way that works for you. Forget about whether or not I said something and do what you know works for you. But if you're still upset, your solutions are still going to be kind of flavored with that anger or that frustration. Right? And that might happen for good reason. And sometimes in conflicts, the other side needs to see that you're angry in order for them to act. I don't want this to sound like I'm contradicting myself, but you're not going to come up with a good plan while you're still worked up into a frenzy. And so if you take the steps that you can to get that mitigated, you might say to me, well, all right, Wim, that's great and all, but some conflicts, there is no way to think about it without getting angry. What do you do then? Well, first of all, if you know that you're going to be whipped up into a frenzy, it's probably a good idea to make sure that you're avoiding the other person in whatever capacity you have ability to influence that. Shuttle diplomacy might work really well in that case, where you could talk to the neutral third party or a third party who's going to go back and forth. Right? This is something that you may have to suggest to somebody who's gone through a particularly painful divorce, and where they have the painful divorce, the prior history as having been partners, but now like they have to figure out what to do about child custody. And if one person seeing the other person just throws everything off every time, there's probably going to have to be the establishment, or it would probably be helpful to have the establishment of some system so that that could be bypassed or avoided, right? Person could drop the kids off at a neutral location, leave, the other person can come pick them up so that they don't have to be in the same place at the same time. And that would be motivated by, that would be better for the kids than for the kids to see the parents fighting, right? It's not good developmentally for kids to see parents fighting. There could be healthy arguments. There could be unhealthy arguments. But there could be healthy resolution to conflict. But if what you see is a clearly negative, destructive behavior, figuring out mechanisms that you can achieve some sort of mutually satisfying goal, right? Both parents can say, I don't want the kids to see us this way, and agree on that, at least that part, and then act on it, right? Again, how do feelings and emotions play in understanding conflict? Well, sometimes feelings and emotions have everything to do with conflict. Sometimes feelings and emotions really have nothing to do with the conflict. But feelings and emotions influencing conflict can happen in ways that we have control over and that we don't have control over. And the more we think about that, identify which parts we have control over, identify which parts we don't have control over, and make plans so that we can address what those emotions and feelings will do to our conflicts, the better we are in advancing towards positive outcomes and also achieving our own personal goals. See you on the next one.